I want you to listen carefully to what I'm about to tell you. Not because it's comfortable, not because it ends well, but because what happened inside that underground room in Berlin in the final weeks of April 1945 is one of the most extraordinary and disturbing collapses of power in all of recorded history, and almost nobody talks about what it truly felt like to be inside it. I was not there, but I have spent years reading the testimonies of the men and women who were. The adjutants, the secretaries, the generals who stood at those maps and watched a madman move armies that no longer existed. And I am going to tell you exactly what those final days looked like. Over be over, decision by decision, breakdown by breakdown, because the story of the Vorbunker is not just a story about Adolf Hitler. It is a story about what happens when an entire system of power refuses to accept reality. And it is more relevant today than most people are willing to admit. If you've been with this channel for any amount of time, you already know I don't do sanitized history. I don't round the edges. I show you what it actually looked and smelled and sounded like. So before we go any further, subscribe if you haven't already, and hit that notification bell, because what I'm about to walk you through is going to change the way you understand the end of the Second World War forever. Let's go back to the beginning of the end. The Vorbunker was not always the place where Hitler lived. For most of the war, he operated from a series of field headquarters. The Wolf's Lair in East Prussia, the Berghof in Bavaria, various command posts scattered across occupied Europe. He was a man who believed in forward momentum, a man who defined himself by expansion, by conquest, by the idea that sheer will could bend the physical laws of military reality. In the early years of the war, this quality, this absolute refusal to accept limitation, had produced results that seemed almost miraculous to those watching from the outside. France had fallen in 6 weeks. Norway, Denmark, the Low Countries, Yugoslavia, Greece, and then, in the summer of 1941, the vast machinery of the German military had turned east, and for a time, for a terrifying and intoxicating time, it had seemed possible that even the Soviet Union would fall. But by January 1945, the physical laws had stopped cooperating. The Red Army had crossed the Vistula. Warsaw had fallen. The Western Allies were massing on the Rhine. Germany was being squeezed from both sides, and Hitler, pale, trembling, physically deteriorating from years of drug injections administered by his personal physician, Theodor Morell, descended into the bunker complex beneath the Reich in Berlin and largely did not come out again. To understand what this meant, to understand why a man who had spent years projecting dominance and certainty would retreat underground and stay there, you have to understand something about the psychology of the Führer, the leader principle. The central ideological claim of the Nazi state was that Hitler was not merely a political leader. He was the embodiment of the German will. He was the vessel through which history would flow. His decisions were not policy, they were destiny. And if destiny itself had started to turn, if the movement was losing, if the armies were falling back, that could only mean one thing in the framework of the system he had built. It could not be the fault of the idea. It had to be the fault of the people executing the idea. Traitors, cowards, men who lacked the will that he possessed. The ideological framework made it literally impossible for the system to assign blame correctly, because correct assignment of blame would have destroyed the system's reason for existing. This is not a small thing. This is not mere stubbornness or pride. This is a complete and total severance of cause and effect. Inside the Vorbunker, the relationship between decisions and outcomes had broken down so completely that the men in that room were operating in two entirely separate versions of reality simultaneously. The reality that appeared on the maps, and the reality that was happening in the fields and streets above their heads. The Vorbunker itself was a remarkable piece of engineering for its time. It sat roughly 8 meters below the surface, beneath the old Reich Chancellery Garden. Reinforced concrete walls, nearly 4 meters thick. Steel blast doors, its own independent power supply, its own ventilation system, its own water supply. 18 small rooms arranged along 2 corridors. The space was claustrophobic, damp, perpetually vibrating from the impact of Allied bombs falling on the city above. The ventilation system recycled the same air over and over, leaving it stale and thick with cigarette smoke and the smell of unwashed bodies and anxiety. There was actually a larger complex connected to the Vorbunker, the Vorbunker, or forward bunker, which sat slightly less deep and had been built first, before the more protected lower level was added. In 1944, the Vorbunker was where Goebbels and his family would eventually take up residence in the final days, where many of the staff officers had their quarters, where the kitchens and some of the service areas were located. The Vorbunker proper, the lower, deeper section, was Hitler's personal domain. Hitler's private suite occupied 6 of those rooms: a study, a bedroom, a bathroom, a map room, a conference antechamber, and a small sitting room. The decor was austere by any measure: bare concrete walls, simple furniture, a portrait of Frederick the Great that Hitler had brought from the Reich chancellery above. He stared at that portrait obsessively in the final days, convinced that Frederick's darkest hour before his eventual triumph offered some kind of divine parallel to his own situation. It did not. The portrait deserves a moment of attention, because it tells you something important about how Hitler was constructing reality in those final weeks. Frederick the Great, Friedrich II of Prussia, had indeed survived what appeared to be total military catastrophe during the 7 Years' War. Surrounded by enemies, outnumbered on every front, his kingdom apparently doomed, Frederick had somehow persevered. His salvation had come in part through what Prussian historians called the miracle of the House of Brandenburg, the death of Empress Elizabeth of Russia in January 1762, which caused Russia to withdraw from the war entirely and flip to the Prussian side. Hitler was waiting for his own miracle. He had said so explicitly to multiple people in the final months. He believed, or perhaps more precisely, he needed to believe that some equivalent rupture in the Allied coalition was coming, that Roosevelt's death, or a falling out between the Americans and the Soviets, or some other unforeseen catastrophe would shatter the alliance against him. Franklin Roosevelt died on April 12, 1945. News of his death reached the bunker that evening, and the reaction was extraordinary. Goebbels, who had been among the most psychologically astute in the purely manipulative sense of the Nazi leadership, telephoned Hitler with the news in a state of barely contained elation. He compared the moment explicitly to the miracle of the House of Brandenburg. Hitler's reaction was reportedly similar: a surge of conviction that the tide was turning, that this was the sign he had been waiting for. The euphoria lasted less than 24 hours. The Allied coalition did not fracture. Harry Truman made clear within hours that the United States intended to continue pursuing unconditional German surrender. The miracle did not materialize, and those who had watched the brief eruption of hope in the bunker were left to deal with the aftermath. The crash back into reality that came when another false horizon turned out to be nothing. To understand what happened in that bunker, you have to understand the daily rhythm of life inside it. Because there was a rhythm, that's what people find hardest to believe. Even in the final weeks of a catastrophic, total, irreversible collapse, there was a schedule. Hitler typically woke in the late morning or early afternoon. He had always been a night creature, keeping hours that drove his military staff to exhaustion. His personal physician would arrive to administer his daily regimen of injections, vitamin, glucose, various stimulants that Mora had been pumping into him since 1941. By the early months of 1945, the list of substances Hitler was receiving on a daily basis had grown to something like 80 different compounds: amphetamines, barbiturates, opioids, testosterone eucodal, which is a brand name for Pervitin, the methamphetamine tablets that had been widely distributed to German troops in the early war years. His body was a chemical experiment, and it so ed. The question of how much. Hitler's deteriorating physical and psychological state was attributable to drug effects versus underlying disease has occupied historians and physicians for decades. Parkinson's disease has been suggested as a diagnosis based on the tremor in his left hand and his increasingly shuffling gait. Some researchers have argued for a form of progressive neurological degeneration. Others have focused on the cumulative effects of years of pharmaceutical polypharmacy under the care of a physician whose credentials and competence were dubious at best. What is clear from every eyewitness account is that the man who emerged from his suite each afternoon in April 1945 was physically a ruin. His left hand shook with what witnesses described as a constant, involuntary palsy. He walked hunched, almost as if carrying a physical weight. His face had aged dramatically. Photographs from late 1944 and early 1945 show a man who looks 20 years older than the figure who had stood before the Reichstag in 1939 and announced that war had begun. And yet, he still presided. He still held court. He still expected his generals to stand at attention when he entered the room. The military situation conferences, Tilache Besprechungen, were the central ritual of bunker life. They happened twice daily, once in the afternoon and once around midnight. These were not small gatherings. At their peak, the afternoon conferences might involve 20 or 30 people, senior generals, their aides, intelligence officers, liaison personnel from the various branches of the armed forces. They would gather in the map room of the bunker or, in the earlier weeks, in the larger conference facilities of the Reich Chancellery above, and Hitler would receive reports from each front and make decisions. The structure of these conferences was elaborate and ritualized. Reports were given in a specific order: the Eastern Front first, then the Western, then the aerial situation, then naval. Each briefer had a specific time allocation. Questions were asked in a specific sequence. The physical arrangement of people around the map table was not accidental. Who stood where? Who had the right to speak without being addressed first? Who was visible to Hitler and who was not? All of this carried enormous political weight. The cast of characters shifted over time, but the core players in those final weeks were consistent. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keith, the chief of the OKW, the Supreme Command of the Armed Forces, whom the rest of the staff privately called Lakitzil, a play on Lakai, meaning that Keitel was a man of limited strategic vision who had survived by the simple expedient of agreeing with Hitler about almost everything. He was not a coward, exactly. He had physical courage. He was something more insidious, a man of genuine personal loyalty to a leader whose orders should have been refused years earlier. General Alfred Jodl, the chief operations officer, precise and cold and increasingly aware that the war was lost, but incapable of saying so. Jodl had a penetrating strategic intelligence and spent much of the final months carefully documenting his objections in ways that would be legible after the fact, while never delivering those objections in a form that might change anything. General Hans Krebs had replaced Guderian as Army Chief of Staff in late March 1945, a relative unknown who had the misfortune of being the last man to hold that position. Krebs had been the German military attaché in Moscow before the war and spoke fluent Russian, a detail that would become relevant at the very end. Martin Bormann, Hitler's personal secretary and gatekeeper, controlled access to the Führer with the obsessive jealousy of a man who understood that his power existed only as long as Hitler breathed. Bormann had built his position over years of patient bureaucratic maneuvering, inserting himself between Hitler and everyone else, controlling the flow of information and people, becoming indispensable in a way that had no relationship to any conventional form of competence or loyalty. And then there were the junior staff, the adjutants and orderlies and stenographers who stood along the walls and watched and listened and tried to make sense of what they were witnessing. Many of them left accounts. Some of those accounts contradict each other on the specifics, but they agree on the atmosphere, the temperature in that room. What they describe is something between a theater and a madhouse. The maps were the center of everything. Large paper maps spread across the conference table, covered with markers and colored lines indicating unit positions. But here is the thing you need to understand about those maps. In the final weeks of the war, were lies. Not lies in the sense that someone had deliberately falsified them. Lies in the sense that the information feeding into them was outdated, incomplete, or simply invented by subordinate commanders who were terrified of reporting the truth to Hitler. This was one of the defining psychological dynamics of the Third Reich in its death agony. the complete collapse of accurate information flow. Commanders in the field knew that reporting catastrophic news to Berlin was dangerous. Hitler had a documented history of sacking, and in some cases having shot commanders who retreated without orders or reported defeats. So, they reported partial advances. They rounded up their strength figures. They described units as combat ready, when those units existed only on paper, and the lie traveled upward through the chain of command, accumulating distortion at each level, until by the time it reached the map table in the forebunker, it had almost no relationship to reality whatsoever. The unit strengths reported in the conferences were not the actual unit strengths in the field. The positions marked on the maps were often where units had been days or weeks earlier. The offensive operations that Hitler ordered were ordered against forces that did not exist, in the numbers or the condition the maps suggested, and no one at the map table, not Cadil, not Jodel, not Krebs, was willing to say so directly. They might hedge. They might note that communications had been disrupted, that confirmation was awaited, that the picture might be subject to revision, but they did not look at the man standing over the map and say, "These numbers are false. These units cannot do what you are asking them to do. This plan has no connection to the reality on the ground." Why not? This is a question that has occupied historians, psychologists, and military analysts for 80 years. The answer has multiple layers. The first layer is simple personal terror. Hitler's rages were legendary, and they were real. The conference room on April 22nd would demonstrate what it looked like when that rage was fully unleashed. People who had seen it before, or who had heard about it from others who had seen it, were not eager to be the person who triggered it. The second layer is institutional. The Wehrmacht had developed over 12 years of Nazi rule, a culture in which bringing bad news to leadership was a career-ending and sometimes life-ending activity. This was not unique to Nazi Germany. Authoritarian systems reliably produced this dynamic, but the Third Reich had pushed it to an extreme. The officers who had tried to resist Hitler's decisions earlier in the war, who had counseled caution, who had urged retreat, who had objected on professional military grounds to operations they believed were unsound, had been systematically removed. What remained by 1945 was a cohort selected, in effect, for compliance. The third layer is psychological. There is a phenomenon that some social psychologists call pluralistic ignorance, a situation in which everyone in a group privately doubts something that everyone else appears to believe, and because no one expresses the private doubt, the public fiction is maintained. In there, almost everyone in the room knew that the situation was catastrophically worse than the map suggested. But because no one said so, because the ritual of the conference required everyone to participate in the fiction, each individual experienced the silence of the others as evidence that perhaps they alone were seeing things incorrectly. Perhaps the Führer knew something they did not. Perhaps there was something in the strategic picture that justified the continued confidence. The silence of the group reinforced the lie for each member of the group. The most infamous example of how this dynamic played out was the deployment orders for General Felix Steiner's army group in mid-April 1945. Steiner commanded a force that was theoretically positioned north of Berlin and theoretically capable of attacking southward to relieve the city. Hitler, in the grip of one of his increasingly grandiose strategic fantasies, ordered Steiner to launch a massive offensive that would drive back the Soviet encirclement and turn the tide of the war. The problem was that Steiner's forces were a ghost, a collection of exhausted remnants, poorly equipped, massively outnumbered, in no condition to attack anything. Steiner knew it. His commanders knew it. Every officer in the chain of command between Steiner and the bunker knew it, and yet the order was issued, and Steiner was expected to comply, and everyone in the bunker waited for a result that could not possibly come. To understand the full grotesquerie of this moment, you need to know something about Felix Steiner himself. He was not a fool. He was, by the standards of the late war, a competent and even thoughtful senior commander. He had led SS units on the Eastern Front and had developed a reputation for protecting his men, insofar as that was possible in the slaughter of the Eastern Front by refusing to execute operationally absurd orders when he could avoid doing so. He had been brought into this new command specifically because Hitler believed he was aggressive enough to carry out what was being asked of him. Hitler had misread the man entirely. Steiner assessed his forces. He looked at the maps. He had perhaps 60 to 70,000 men in his nominal command area, but of those, an unknown but substantial fraction were either not in contact, not equipped, not combat ready, or simply not present in any meaningful sense. To mount the massive armored assault that the bunker was expecting would have required resources that did not exist anywhere within 300 kilometers of his position. He did what any rational commander would have done. He did nothing. He organized a small defensive action. He held his lines. He did not attack. And he did not tell the bunker that he was not going to attack. So Hitler waited, confident, certain that the attack was coming, certain that Steiner would deliver the miracle. And in the conference room, the markers on the map showed Steiner's forces in their attack positions, and the generals looked at the map and said nothing. April 22nd, 1945. This is the day that changed everything. The afternoon situation conference began like any other. Hitler stood over the maps, expecting reports of Steiner's offensive progress. What he received instead was the news that Steiner had not attacked. Could not attack, that the Soviet forces were continuing to advance on Berlin unchecked, that Soviet armor was now in the northern suburbs of the city, that the encirclement that had seemed theoretical a week ago was now, in military terms, essentially complete. What followed was described by nearly every witness as the most terrifying episode they had ever witnessed in any human being. Hitler erupted, not in the controlled, theatrical rages he had performed for political effect throughout his career, the carefully calibrated fury deployed to intimidate foreign diplomats, to silence wavering party members, to demonstrate to the German people that their leader's will was absolute. This was different. This was something that broke through whatever psychological scaffolding had been holding him together. Witnesses described his face turning purple, his trembling hand striking the table, his voice rising to a scream, and then breaking into something that was almost not human. He accused his generals of treachery. He accused the Wehrmacht of betraying him from the beginning. He said he had always been surrounded by liars and incompetents and cowards. He named names. He leveled accusations that had been building for months, possibly years, and that now came out in an uncontrolled torrent. The scene lasted several hours. Some witnesses say it went on for 3 hours. Others say longer. The room emptied gradually as Hitler's rage continued, not because anyone dared simply walk out, but because people found reasons to step briefly into adjoining rooms, to take telephone calls, to review documents, to be anywhere other than directly in the line of fire. Those who stayed described watching something collapse in real time, not just the man's composure. Something structural, something foundational. And then he said something that stunned the room into silence. He said he would stay in Berlin. He would not retreat to Bavaria. He would not go to the supposed Alpenfestung, the Alpine fortress, the mythological last redoubt in the mountains that Nazi propaganda had been vaguely gesturing toward for months as a possible final stronghold. He would remain in the city. He would command the defense of Berlin from the bunker. And when the city fell, and he acknowledged, in this moment of extraordinary clarity, cutting through the derangement, that it might fall, he would die there. Most of the generals tried to argue. Keitel urged him to go south. Jodl suggested that the situation was still recoverable if he moved the command structure to the Oberst. Krebs made cautious noises about operational flexibility, but Hitler had made up his mind. And when Hitler made up his mind, even at this stage, even in this condition, even with the evidence of catastrophic failure all around him, no one in that room was capable of changing it. The habit of deference was too deep. The history of what had happened to people who pushed back too hard was too vivid. The senior military staff were ordered out of Berlin to coordinate the final defense from positions further afield. Keitel and Jodl left. They set up a new command post in Krampnitz, then later moved to other locations as the Soviet advance continued. Krebs stayed in the bunker. Bormann stayed. A small core of the personal staff stayed, and the bunker sealed itself off from the last of its connections to the outside world. This moment, April 22nd, the breakdown. The decision to stay is sometimes described as the point at which Hitler finally confronted reality. But I want to push back on that interpretation, because I think it's wrong in an important way. The decision to stay in Berlin was not a confrontation with reality. It was reality's final intrusion into the delusional system. Yes, but Hitler's response to that intrusion was not to revise the system. It was to collapse the system entirely and replace it with something even more disconnected. The idea that he would stay and die in Berlin was, in its own way, just as untethered from rational analysis as the idea that Steiner's Phantom Army would save the city. It was simply a different fantasy. Instead of the fantasy of victory, it was the fantasy of a heroic and historically significant death. A martyr's death, a Wagnerian death. A death that would somehow redeem the failure of everything that had come before. Frederick the Great had not died in his bunker, but the Führer would die in his, and that death would be, in the internal logic of the system, meaningful. It would mean something. It would be remembered. History would eventually vindicate him, as it had vindicated Frederick. It will not. Eva Braun arrived in Berlin on April 15th, flying in from Munich against Hitler's explicit orders. She had been told to stay at the Berghof in Bavaria, where she would be safe, where she could wait out whatever came next. She ignored him. If he was going to die in Berlin, she was going to die in Berlin. Whatever you think of Eva Braun, and she has been portrayed variously across 80 years of historical writing as a victim who did not understand what she was part of, as a conscious enabler who shared responsibility for everything done in Hitler's name, as a woman of genuine personal loyalty to a man she had genuinely loved, as a figure of almost tragic banality who wandered into the center of history through an accident of personal connection. What is undeniable is that in those final days, she was the one person in the bunker who was not performing. Everyone else in that underground space was performing some version of a role. The generals performing loyalty while internally calculating how long they had before the Russians arrived. Bormann performing devotion while actually positioning himself to survive whatever came next. The secretaries and adjutants performing professional composure while privately terrified. Even Hitler himself was performing, in a sense. Performing the role of the defiant leader, the man who had chosen death over surrender, the heroic figure who would go down with his city. Eva Braun was not performing anything. She sat in Hitler's small sitting room, played records on a gramophone. The same records. Aubert and Aubert, because their supply was limited. Offered cognac to the secretaries who came to sit with her, and spoke with a calm about death that the other women in the bunker found both admirable and unnerving. She organized small social gatherings. She brought a kind of surface normality to a space that had become radically abnormal. She told Trudel June, one of Hitler's personal secretaries, who left perhaps the most vivid first-hand account of bunker life, that she was not afraid, that she had known for a long time that this was how it would end, that she had chosen it. Trudel Jung was 25 years old. She had not chosen it. Not in the same way. She had come to work for Hitler as a personal secretary in 1942, a young woman from Munich who had passed a typing test and found herself suddenly in the most consequential household in Germany. She had been present at the Wolf's Lair. She had typed Hitler's personal correspondence. She had been, by her own account, charmed by a man who was personally kind to her, who remembered her name, who asked after her well-being, who was courteous in the way that powerful men sometimes are courteous to people who pose no threat to them. It is one of the most disturbing aspects of the Vorbunker testimonies, the insistence, repeated across multiple accounts, on how ordinary Hitler was in his personal relationships. He was kind to his secretaries. He was fond of children and dogs. He was a considerate host. He remembered birthdays. The secretaries who worked most closely with him, Jung, Christa, Schroeder, Herda Christian, all describe a man who was, in the private sphere, recognizably and uncomfortably human. This was not the monster of the newsreels and the propaganda posters. This was a man who ate cake and talked about his dog and made small jokes and noticed when you were tired. And this is one of the things I want you to sit with, because it is deeply uncomfortable. The man who ordered the Holocaust, who signed the orders that set the machinery of mass murder in motion across occupied Europe, was also, to the people around him every day, simply a person who could make them feel seen and valued. A person whose approval meant something, a person whose disapproval was devastating. The ordinariness of it is not a reassurance. The ordinariness of it is the most terrifying thing about it. Trudel Jung was trapped by circumstance, by the peculiar psychological gravity that the bunker exerted on everyone within it, by the difficulty of simply leaving a place that had become the center of the world. Later in life, she would spend decades grappling with her own complicity. She gave interviews in her 70s and 80s that are among the most remarkable documents of historical reckoning. I have encountered a woman trying, with genuine intellectual honesty, to understand how she had ended up typing the last words of the man who caused the death of tens of millions of people, and what that meant about her, and what it meant about all of them. Now let me tell you about the last great delusion, because even after April 22nd, even after the breakdown, even after Hitler had declared he was going to die in Berlin, there was one more round of false hope. One more moment when the machinery of delusion managed to generate something that looked, from inside the bunker, like salvation. On April 26th and 27th, as Soviet forces tightened their grip on Berlin and began fighting street by street through the outer districts of the city, the maps in the bunker showed two potential relief forces that Hitler seized on with the intensity of a drowning man grabbing at anything within reach. Walther Wenck's 12th Army was positioned to the southwest of Berlin. Near the 12th Army was a real formation, one of the last coherent German military forces remaining in the West. Wenck was a young, capable general, one of the more respected officers of the final war period, and his army had not yet been destroyed by the same attrition that had consumed most of the Wehrmacht's remaining combat power. Hitler ordered Wenck to turn his army eastward and drive toward Berlin. The relief of the capital, the dramatic reversal, and simultaneously, word began reaching the bunker that SS forces north of Berlin, the remnants of various formations that had been placed under Steiner's nominal command, were preparing to attack southward. Steiner again, always Steiner. For a brief, extraordinary period, Hitler became animated again. He moved the markers on the map. He gave orders with something approaching his old precision and energy. He spoke of counterattacks, of the city being held, of the Soviets being caught in a pit. The atmosphere in the bunkers shifted slightly. The pervasive despair lifted a fraction, replaced by something that was not quite hope, but was at least the simulation of forward movement. None of it was real. Or, rather, Wenck was real. But Wenck had made a decision that was both militarily and humanly correct, and that had nothing to do with relieving Berlin. Wenck assessed his situation. He understood that any attempt to drive into the Soviet encirclement around Berlin would result in the destruction of his army and accomplish nothing. He also understood that to his west were American forces, and that the Americans were unlikely to treat German prisoners the way the Soviets treated them. And so Wenck turned his army not east toward Berlin, but west toward the Elbe, and began using his forces to help as many German civilians and soldiers as possible cross the river into American captivity. This was the right decision by any rational, military, and humanitarian calculus. Wenck saved tens of thousands of lives with that choice, but he was not coming to relieve Berlin. And by April 28th, this was becoming clear even through the information fog of the bunker. And Steiner's forces never came at all. The men inside the bunker who knew the real situation, and by this point, that was essentially all of them, watched. Hitler pored over the maps in the small hours of April 29th, moving units that could not move, planning operations that would never happen, and they said nothing. The moment for saying something had long since passed. Heinrich Himmler's betrayal hit the bunker like a physical blow. On the night of April 28th, into April 29th, a BBC radio broadcast, monitored by the bunker's communications staff, reported that Himmler had been in secret negotiations with Count Folke Bernadotte of Sweden, attempting to arrange a separate peace with the Western Allies. The negotiations had been going on for weeks, conducted in greatest secrecy, with Himmler presenting himself as a potential new German leader who could be dealt with reasonably, as opposed to the man still alive in the bunker below Berlin. I want you to understand what this meant in the context of the bunker Himmler. DS, the man responsible for the concentration camp system, the man who had more than perhaps any other single individual, aside from Hitler himself, built the apparatus of mass murder that defined the Third Reich. This was the man who had decided that Hitler was finished and had gone shopping for a separate piece. There was something almost grotesque in the logic of it. Himmler apparently believed. And this tells you something profound about the degree to which these men had lost contact with external reality, that the Western Allies would view him as an acceptable interlocutor, that Eisenhower would sit across a table from the man who ran the SS and negotiate terms. Bernadotte had been clear in his communications to Himmler that this was not going to happen, that the Allies' position of unconditional surrender was firm, but Himmler had apparently not fully absorbed this. He had spent so long inside the closed system of the Third Reich, where everyone's behavior was shaped by his power, that he could not quite believe the outside world would not respond to him in the same way. Hitler's reaction was of all the betrayals, and there had been many, real and imagined, through the final months of the war, this one struck him as the most personally devastating. He ordered Himmler's arrest. He stripped him of all his offices and titles: Ace, Chief of the German Police, Minister of the Interior, Commander of Army Group Vistula. Every post and honor that had been accumulated over years of faithful service. He had one of Himmler's representatives, who happened to be in Berlin, un SAS General named Hermann, who was also the husband of Eva Braun's sister, arrested and shot. The execution of Fegelein deserves a moment. Fegelein had been trying to leave Berlin quietly in civilian clothes when he was caught. His position as Eva Braun's brother-in-law offered him no protection. He was brought before an improvised court-martial, found guilty of desertion and cowardice, and shot in the Reich Chancellery Garden on the evening of April 28th. It was 38 years old. Whether Hitler's decision to have him executed was driven by military principle, by rage at Himmler's betrayal, or by something more personal, is a question that different historians have answered differently. What is not in question is that it happened, and that the other people in the bunker observed it happening, and that none of them were particularly surprised. The night of April 28th into April 29th was when Hitler dictated his last will and testament. Two documents. The political testament addressed the future of Germany and the reasons, as Hitler understood them, for the catastrophe that had occurred. It was, in many ways, the clearest window into the state of his ideology at the very end. He blamed the Jews for the war, not Germany's aggression, not the invasion of Poland, not the attack on the Soviet Union. The Jews. The obsession that had driven him to power, that had provided the ideological framework for the Holocaust, that had structured his understanding of history and politics and human nature, this obsession had not been revised by failure. It had been confirmed by it. The political testament expelled Göring and Himmler from the party and named Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz as his successor as Reich president. The personal testament explained his decision to marry Eva Braun as a recognition. He wrote of her years of faithful service before they died together. He bequeathed his art collection to the German state. He gave instructions for the disposition of his property, and he arranged, in careful detail, how his body and Eva Braun's body should be disposed of after their deaths, burned completely. No remains, nothing that could be displayed. Tradell Jung typed both documents. She has described the experience as surreal, sitting in a small underground room, typing the last words of a man who had shaped the century, while Soviet artillery shook the concrete above her head, and feeling almost nothing. Not grief, not relief, a kind of emptiness that she found frightening in itself. She said later that she wondered, even as she was typing, whether she was experiencing something or whether the situation had grown so extreme that her capacity to experience it had simply shut down. The wedding ceremony was held in the early hours of April 29th. In the small conference room of the bunker, it was performed by a city official named Walter Wagner, who had been found somewhere in the chaos of besieged Berlin and brought underground specifically for this purpose. Wagner himself was in Volkssturm uniform. He had been serving in the Lausitz militia of old, men and boys that Germany had scraped together for the final defense. He would be dead within days. The ceremony was brief. Hitler and Eva Braun confirmed that they were of pure Aryan descent, the standard bureaucratic requirement for a German marriage under Nazi law, and Wagner pronounced them man and wife. The witnesses were Bormann and Go. Afterward, there was a small reception in Hitler's sitting room. Champagne was served. People gave toasts. Some of the older members of the staff, secretaries who had been with Hitler for years, who had followed him across multiple command posts and countries in years, cried, not necessarily out of joy at the marriage. Something more complicated, the sense of an era ending. The sense of finality, made physical and Hitler sat quietly, abstracted, speaking when spoken to, but clearly already somewhere else in his mind. Eva Braun, Eva Hitler, as she had been for less than an hour, was described by multiple witnesses as the most composed person in the room. Whatever had driven her to fly back to Berlin against his explicit instructions, whatever had sustained her through the weeks in the bunker, she had achieved what she had wanted. She had married him, and the equanimity she had been displaying for days, the eerie calm about death, remained intact. I want to pause here and ask you something, because I think it matters. How do you explain what the people in that bunker were feeling in these final days? Not Hitler specifically. His psychology is its own labyrinth, documented in dozens of volumes, and still not fully mapped. But the staff, the secretaries, the adjutants, the generals who had stayed. They were not, for the most part, ideological fanatics. They were people who had been drawn into proximity to power, who had structured their identities around that proximity, who had built careers and relationships and routines around the daily work of this particular institution. And they found, when the institution began to fail, that they had no framework for understanding who they were without it. Psychologists who have studied authoritarian collapse describe a phenomenon sometimes called totalitarian binding, the way that an all-encompassing system doesn't just control behavior, but actually reshapes the psychological architecture of the people inside it. Your relationships, your sense of purpose, your understanding of history and meaning, all of it becomes dependent on the system's internal logic. You stop being able to evaluate events from outside the system, because the system has colonized the cognitive space where independent evaluation would happen. When the system fails, the cognitive dissonance can be, you cannot process the failure through the system's framework, because the failure is the refutation of the framework. And you cannot step outside the framework because you have lost the mental tools to do so. This is why the bunker staff kept performing the rituals. The situation conferences with their careful maps and their coded language and their precise physical arrangements. The meal times with their specific hierarchies of who sat where and who was served first. The personal interactions with their elaborate protocols of rank and address. Not because those rituals had any functional purpose anymore, but because stopping them would have meant confronting the full weight of what was happening. And that was too much. The Goebbels family is perhaps the most extreme illustration of what totalitarian binding could produce. Joseph Goebbels had remained in the bunker with his wife Magda and their 6 children, Helga, Hildegard, Helmut, Hildine Hedwig, and Heidrun, ranging in age from 4 to 12. He had turned down multiple opportunities to leave Berlin, to get his family to safety, to ensure his children's survival. He had not done so because he was certain of German victory. By this point, Goebbels of all people could not have entertained that illusion. He had done so because he had decided that there was nothing worth living for outside the system he had helped to create, and now could not imagine existing without. Magda Goebbels shared this conviction, or had convinced herself that she did. She had written letters in those final weeks explaining that she could not allow her children to grow up in a world without National Socialism, that such a world was not worth living in, that she was protecting them from it. Let that settle for a moment. A world without National Socialism, which meant a world without the concentration camps, without the forced labor, without the mass murder, without the systematic destruction of entire peoples and cultures, was, in Magda Goebbels' framework, a world not worth living in. The ideology had consumed her so completely that its antithesis read not as liberation, but as catastrophe. April 30th, 1945. The day began with one of the last situation conferences. The news was unambiguous. Soviet forces were fighting in the streets of central Berlin, the Reichstag building, the symbolic heart of German parliamentary government. burned in 1933 in an arson that the Nazis had used to consolidate power, was under direct assault. Red Army soldiers were less than a kilometer from the Reich Chancellery. Berlin was not going to hold for another 24 hours. Hitler took a midday meal with his 2 remaining personal secretaries and his vegetarian cook, Constance Manzili, in a small dining area of the bunker. He was apparently calm. He ate, he made some conversation. He was, by the accounts of those present, completely himself, or rather, completely the version of himself that the bunker had produced over the preceding weeks. Quiet, abstracted, occasionally precise about some specific detail, capable of ordinary social interaction while simultaneously giving no outward sign that he understood the full dimensions of what was about to happen. After the meal, Hitler walked through the bunker, greeting the staff who had gathered. He shook hands. He spoke briefly to some of them. To Trodel Jung, he said something she could not hear clearly over the sound of the artillery. She nodded as if she had understood. Moveth on. Around 2:30 in the afternoon, Hitler and Eva Braun retired to his private suite. Eva Braun had already taken a poisoned capsule from the supply that had been distributed to the senior bunker personnel. Glass capsules of potassium cyanide, the same type that Himmler would use when captured by British soldiers a few weeks later. Outside the closed door, the staff waited, some of them standing in the corridor, some of them in the antechamber. The sounds of the bunker continued around them, the ventilation hummed, the distant explosions, now very close indeed, the murmur of people in the corridor, the occasional metallic creak of the structure responding to a near impact. Time moved strangely in that space. It always did in the bunker. The artificial light was constant. No windows, no daylight, no relationship between the clock and any natural rhythm. People lost track of time in the bunker in a way that felt deliberately designed, though of course it was simply the consequence of the architecture. You ate when food was served. You slept when you could. You were awake when someone needed you to be awake. The ordinary markers of time had dissolved. A single gunshot was heard from behind the closed door. That's what most accounts say, a single shot. Others say they heard nothing until the door was opened. The accounts vary on this point, and perhaps that's appropriate. Perhaps it was too loud outside. Perhaps the thick concrete and the steel door muffled it. Perhaps some of the people waiting in the corridor had learned, over the preceding weeks, not to pay close attention to things they did not want to know about. Hitler was found on the sofa, a gunshot wound to his right temple. Eva Braun was beside him. She had taken the cyanide, the smell of bitter almonds. The classic signature of prussic acid poisoning was reportedly noticeable when the door was opened. Per Hitler's instructions, their bodies were carried up to the Reich Chancellery garden above. It was a difficult and dangerous task. The stairwell leading up from the bunker was narrow. The bodies had to be carried in a particular way to navigate it. Soviet aircraft were periodically flying over. Artillery was landing in the area. The SS men who had been given this task, some of the most loyal of the personal guard, performed it under fire, in the open, in what had become essentially a combat zone. Petrol had been brought up from the motor pool, several jerrycans worth. The bodies were laid in a shallow depression in the garden, doused with petrol and ignited. The men who lit the fire retreated quickly back to the bunker entrance. They watched from the doorway. Some of them, by their own accounts, gave the Nazi salute. Then they went back inside. The burning continued for several hours. Petrol was added multiple times. By the time the fire was finished, very little remained. Dental fragments, some bone. The Soviets who found the remains days later subjected them to multiple investigations over the subsequent decades. Investigations that were classified, whose results were disputed, whose findings were partially falsified for political reasons. The question of what happened to Hitler's remains became one of the stranger subplots of Cold War intelligence history. In 2018, French forensic scientists who were given access to teeth held in Russian archives conducted a detailed comparative analysis against Hitler's known dental records. The match was confirmed. The fragments were consistent with being Hitler's teeth. He had died in the bunker on April 30th, 1945. He had not escaped to Argentina. He had not survived in some hidden awash, dead. But the bunker went on. This is what I find most extraordinary about the days that followed, and what I want you to think about carefully, because the machine that Hitler had built did not stop when Hitler stopped. It creaked and ground and convulsed, but it kept running for several more days, because the people inside it had no other mode of operation. Goebbels, who had remained with his family, briefly became the new Reich Chancellor, as Hitler's political testament had specified. He held the title for approximately 1 day. He used that day to make one attempt at negotiation, the mission of General Krebs to Soviet headquarters on the morning of May 1st, and when that failed, he concluded that there was nothing left to do. He had spoken publicly for 12 years about the willingness of the Nazi movement to die rather than surrender. He had written and spoken about death and sacrifice and heroic ends with the fluency of a man who had never expected to actually confront them. Now, he confronted them. The killing of the Goebbels children happened on the evening of May 1st. Hildegard, Helman Holdin, Hedgegard, and Hedgen, 4 years old to 12 years old, sleeping in their bunker quarters, dressed in their nightclothes. Their mother administered the cyanide. There is some evidence that the children were first sedated with morphine so that they would not struggle or know what was happening. The medical personnel in the bunker, the doctors and medics who were still present, were reportedly asked to assist and refused. Magda apparently carried out the act herself, possibly with the help of an SS physician named Ludwig Stumpfiger, who had few evident reservations about such things. Goebbels and Magda died in the Reich Chancellery garden later that evening. An SS adjutant shot them at their request after they had taken cyanide. Whether the cyanide alone was sufficient or whether they had doubts about it is unclear. Their bodies were also burned, though less completely than Hitler's. Soviet investigators found them within days. Bormann made his escape attempt on the night of May 1st into May 2nd, with a group of others, including the physician Stumpfiger, attempting to break through the Soviet lines around Berlin in the chaos of the continuing street fighting. His fate was uncertain for decades. He was tried and convicted in absentia at Nuremberg in 1946 and sentenced to death. Various alleged sightings of him alive in South America, where other Nazis had indeed fled, generated periodic news stories through the 1950s and 1960s. He became one of the great mysteries of the post-war period. His fate, a blank space that conspiracy theories rushed to fill. In 1973, construction work near the Lehrtor station in Berlin uncovered human skeletal remains. They were identified tentatively as Bormann's at the time, based on comparison with dental and medical records. Then, in 1998, DNA analysis using material from a living relative of Bormann confirmed the identification definitively. Martin Bormann had died during the breakout attempt on the night of May 1st to 2nd, 1945, probably from cyanide poisoning when capture by Soviet forces appeared imminent. He had never made it out of Berlin. The mystery that had sustained decades of speculation was resolved by a tooth and a fragment of jawbone lying in a construction site 3 blocks from where he had tried to escape. General Hans Krebs stayed in the bunker until the very end, participated in the surrender negotiations with General Zhukov on May 1st, and killed himself on May 2nd when it became finally clear that the Soviets would accept nothing except unconditional surrender. General Helmuth Weidling, the commandant of Berlin's defense, capitulated formally at 6 in the morning. On May 2nd, 1945, the battle for Berlin, which had cost an estimated 100,000 Soviet soldiers and an unknowable number of German soldiers and civilians, was over. Let me tell you about General Krebs's mission to Zhukov's headquarters on May 1st, because I think it captures something important about the world the bunker had created. Krebs crossed the lines under a white flag in the early hours of May 1st. He was taken to Soviet General Vasily Zhukov at the 8th Guards Army headquarters, then located in a building on the Schulenbergring in southern Berlin. Krebs was not a broken man. He was composed, professional, correct. He informed Zhukov of Hitler's death, apparently the first definitive confirmation the Soviet side had received, though they suspected it, and then he proposed that the two sides enter into negotiations for a ceasefire, to allow a new German government to form, which could then address the question of surrender in a more orderly and politically structured way. Chukov, who had defended Stalingrad and watched his city reduced to rubble and fought for 2.5 years across thousands of kilometers of the most brutal terrain in the history of warfare, listened to this proposal with, by his account, genuine difficulty keeping his composure. The Soviet position had not changed and would not change. Unconditional surrender. All German forces. Immediately. Nothing less. Krebs made telephone calls back to the bunker. More discussions, Goebbels and Bormann deliberated another round of communication. And then the answer came back, no, they would not surrender unconditionally. They would attempt to break out and fight their way to a position where they could negotiate better terms. This tells you everything you need to know about the state of reality assessment among the last inhabitants of the Vorbunker. They had watched Berlin destroyed. They had watched the Reich collapse on every front simultaneously over a period of months. They had watched their Führer shoot himself in a bunker 8 meters underground, and their assessment of the situation was that they could break out of a Soviet encirclement with handfuls of exhausted soldiers and negotiate better surrender terms. The logic of the closed system, right to the very end. I have been reading and studying these events for many years, and there is one question that I come back to constantly, because I don't think it has a satisfying answer, and I think the discomfort of that is important. How did it get this far? Not the war, not even the Holocaust. As incomprehensible as that is, but specifically, how did a man who was, by April of 1945, visibly physically incapacitated, psychologically untethered from any coherent connection to reality, surrounded by catastrophic military failure on every front, how did that man retain the loyalty, or at least the deference, of enough people to keep the machinery running until the very end? Part of the answer is terror. By the final months, the regime was executing German soldiers, civilians, officials, at a rate that had dramatically accelerated. The flying courts-martial of the SS moved through towns and villages, hanging men from lampposts for insufficient resistance to the enemy, for desertion, for defeatism, for remarks made in the wrong company. The threat was not abstract. People kept their mouths shut and kept performing their roles because the alternative might be a noose. But terror alone doesn't account for it. Terror creates compliance. But the compliance in the bunker went beyond that. People weren't just obeying. They were continuing to interpret events through the framework that Hitler provided, continuing to use the language of the movement, continuing to find explanations within the system's own logic, treachery, cowardice, lack of will, Jewish sabotage, rather than confronting the simpler explanation that the entire ideological project had been wrong from the beginning. This is totalitarianism's final, most insidious gift to its subjects. Even when everything collapses, the collapse gets explained in the system's own terms. The movement failed not because it was built on murder and delusion, but because of traitors within. De Tolstoy, legend the stab in the back. That myth had provided the psychological framework for the Nazi movement's rise in the 1920s, and it provided the framework for understanding the movement's fall in 1945. The circle had closed. I want to tell you about one more person before we close, because I think this person's story captures something that the generals and the secretaries, and the Grings and the Himmlers don't quite capture. His name was Rohus Misch. He was Hitler's personal bodyguard and telephone operator, a man whose job was literally to sit outside Hitler's suite and manage his telephone communications. He entered that role young, remained in it for years, and was present in the Vorbunker until nearly the very end. He was captured by the Soviets when Berlin fell, and spent 9 years in captivity before returning to Germany. Misch married, had children, lived a long life in Berlin, working as a decorator. He became, in his old age, one of the most sought-after witnesses to the final days of the bunker, and he gave interviews and testimony for decades. He died in 2013 at the age of 96, the last surviving member of the Vorbunker inner circle. What makes Misch important is not what he knew in terms of strategic or historical significance. He was a relatively minor figure. What makes him important is what he represents. He was not a decision-maker. He was not an idiot. He was a young man who had been assigned a post and had carried it out professionally. He answered the phones. He connected the calls. he stood outside the door. He was doing his job, and in his later interviews, when asked how he felt about what he had witnessed, about his proximity to Hitler, about the fact that he had served faithfully a man responsible for the deaths of tens of millions of people, Misch gave essentially the same answer every time. He said he had just been doing his job. He said that Hitler had always been kind to him personally, that the Führer had been courteous, had remembered his name, had treated him as a person. He said he didn't like to think about the bigger picture. He tried not to think about it at all. He was not a monster by any conventional measure. He was not a fanatic. He was a young man doing a job in the most consequential and murderous institution in modern history. And the fact that he was doing a job and not making strategic decisions did not free him from being part of it. And I think Misch's inability or unwillingness, even decades later, to integrate what he had witnessed into a coherent moral accounting is telling. Not because he was unusual, but because he was ordinary. The Vorbunker ran on people like Rohus Misch. Not primarily on fanatics, on people who were doing their jobs. The final Soviet assault on the Reich Chancellery complex came on the night of May 1st into May 2nd. By the morning of May 2nd, Soviet soldiers had entered the bunker complex. They found it in remarkable order. Papers still on desks in some rooms, dishes in the kitchen, the basic furniture of an institution that had simply stopped operating, the burned patch in the garden, the smell of chemicals in the lower corridor, the bodies of the Goebbels family in the Vorbunker. The Soviets photographed everything meticulously. They took samples of soil from the garden. They gathered documents. They conducted interviews with the few bunker personnel who had not escaped or died. And then they classified most of what they found. Stalin had political reasons for maintaining ambiguity about Hitler's death, ambiguity that he could use in negotiations with the Western Allies, that he could deploy to keep the German population unsettled, that served various intelligence purposes that were not always clear even to those closest to him. The full Soviet account of what was found in the bunker was not made available to Western researchers for decades. The Vorbunker itself was demolished, partially by the East German government in 1947, and more thoroughly in 1988-89, as reunification approached, and the East German state looked for ways to remove a site that could become a place of neo-Nazi pilgrimage. The site sat in no man's land between East and West Berlin, then within East Germany, in an area that became increasingly empty as the wall divided the city. Today the location is marked by a small information board in a parking lot near Potsdamer Platz. The board shows the layout of the bunker, provides historical context, gives the dates. It has been there since 2006. A compromise between documentation and the reasonable concern about what it would mean to mark the site more prominently. Most people who visit that parking lot do not realize what they're standing near. I have stood at that parking lot, and I have tried to feel something commensurate with the weight of what happened beneath my feet. I'm not sure I succeeded. History happens to people in time. We experience it as an echo, a residue, a story told in retrospect, with the shape of its ending already visible. The gap between what happened and what you can feel standing in the place where it happened is, for events of this magnitude, usually unbridgeable. But that gap matters. The distance between what happened and how we remember it matters, because the danger of the Vorbunker is not that we will repeat it precisely. No historical event repeats precisely. The danger is that we lose sight of the mechanism, the way that a group of intelligent, educated, professionally trained people inside a closed system can collectively lose the ability to name what is happening to them. The way that loyalty and fear and identity and the daily routines of professional life can keep people performing roles long after those roles have lost any connection to reality. The way that information gets shaped before it reaches the people who need to make decisions, until the decisions being made have no relationship to the world they are supposedly responding to. The way that a system that punishes the bearer of bad news eventually loses the capacity to receive any accurate news at all. That mechanism does not require a bunker to operate. The decisions that made April 30th, 1945 inevitable were not made in April 1945. They were made years earlier, In hundreds of smaller moments, when people who could have said something chose not to, when people who knew that the information being presented was wrong allowed it to pass on, when people who saw where the logic of the system was leading found ways to rationalize their continued participation, the final days in the bunker were not an aberration. They were the logical endpoint of everything that had preceded them. The grandiosity, the certainty, the contempt for inconvenient information, the punishment of honesty, and the rewarding of flattery. All of it, 12 years of it, compressing down into those last 18 rooms. Those last 18 days, those last hours before a single gunshot ended one chapter of history and left the rest of the world to begin sorting through the wreckage. We are still sorting through it. We will be sorting through it for a very long time. If this video changed the way you understand those final days, if it showed you something you hadn't seen before, made you think about something you hadn't thought about, share it with someone who needs to see it. That is how this kind of history stays alive. Not in textbooks. In conversations. In the questions we keep asking ourselves about how things got to be the way they were, and what it would have taken to make them different. Subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you in the next one. But before I let you go, I want to take you back through something that I think gets lost in the broad sweep of the narrative. The specific texture of daily life in the bunker, because the history books give you the chronology, and the chronology is important, but it is not sufficient. To understand what happened in those rooms, you have to understand what it felt like to be inside them day after day, the accumulation of small moments that made up the larger catastrophe. The smell is one of the things that almost every witness mentions. The bunker smelled. It smelled of damp concrete, of diesel from the generators, of cigarette smoke, although Hitler himself did not smoke and reportedly found the smoke irritating. Most of the military staff smoked heavily, and the ventilation system could not fully clear it. It smelled of food cooking in the kitchen, which could be anything from vegetable soup to whatever could be scavenged from the rapidly diminishing supply chain. And increasingly, as April progressed and the city above began to burn, it smelled of smoke filtering down through the ventilation shafts from above. Not the clean smoke of a fireplace, the thick, chemical-laden smoke of a city burning. Rubber and paint and wood and things that should not burn. The noise was constant. The ventilation system created a low-frequency hum that never stopped. The generators added their own mechanical note, and from above, through 4 meters of reinforced concrete, you could hear the artillery. Not clearly. The concrete absorbed and distorted the sound until it became a kind of low, irregular percussion, a rhythm without pattern. Some witnesses describe becoming so accustomed to it that they stopped noticing it consciously. Others say it never stopped registering, that every impact produced an involuntary flinch response that could not be suppressed no matter how many days passed. The artificial light never changed. Day and night in the forebunker were identical. The overhead fluorescent tubes burned at the same intensity around the clock. This created a profound disorientation, a sense of timelessness that was not the same as peace. More like suspension, more like the feeling of being in a place where normal categories of experience no longer fully applied. People slept in shifts, when they could, in whatever accommodation the cramped space provided. Some of the lower-ranking staff slept on cots in the corridors. Some slept sitting up in chairs. Sleep was interrupted constantly by telephone calls, by the need to respond to some development above, by the physical difficulty of finding a comfortable position in a space that was not designed for long-term habitation. By April, the bunker had been occupied far beyond any timeline its designers had imagined. It was showing the strain. Water was beginning to seep through some of the walls in certain sections. Electrical connections were becoming unreliable. The sense of the structure itself, aging visibly under the weight of the situation, was something several witnesses remarked upon. Food remained available throughout the final weeks, though its quality and variety diminished. Hitler's vegetarian preferences were maintained as long as possible. The cook, Constanza Manziali, continued to prepare his personal meals according to his specifications. For the rest of the staff, the food became progressively simpler. Soup, bread, whatever could be obtained. The supply runs that brought food into the bunker complex became increasingly dangerous as Soviet forces tightened the encirclement and eventually required armed escort and careful timing to avoid Soviet fire. Alcohol was present throughout. The secretaries drank cognac in Eva Braun's sitting room. The military staff drank whatever came to hand. This was not unusual by the standards of the time and place. Alcohol had been a coping mechanism throughout the war, at all levels of the military. But in the bunker, in the final weeks, the drinking had a different quality. It was not social drinking in any normal sense. It was something more desperate. The cognac in Eva Braun's room, shared among women who were trying to maintain composure in the face of circumstances that defied composure, was a chemical mechanism for getting through hours that would otherwise have been unbearable. Traudol. Jung describes a particular afternoon. She does not give the exact date, when she and one of the other secretaries sat with Eva Braun and drank cognac and listened to the same record playing on the gramophone over and over. Eva Braun had a small collection of records, and one of TM, a popular German song. Something light and sentimental had become a kind of obsessive soundtrack. The needle would reach the end, and Eva Braun would lift it and place it back at the beginning, and the song would start again. Jung says that at some point, she stopped being able to hear the music itself and started hearing only the physical sound of the needle on the groove. The slight crackle before the music started, that sound became, for her, associated with everything that was happening. She says she could not hear a record player for years afterward, without a physiological response that she could not fully name. This is the texture of the bunker. These small, perceptual details, these sensory memories that stayed with witnesses for decades, that they returned to again and again when they tried to describe what those weeks had been like. Not the grand decisions, not the conferences, the sound of a record playing in a concrete room while a city burned above. Let me tell you about the children in the bunker, because they are rarely discussed in enough detail, and because I think they illuminate something important about the psychological environment. The Goebbels children arrived in the bunker in late April, brought by their mother from the family home in Magda Goebbels had made her decision the children would not survive into the post-war world. This decision was not made in a moment of crisis. It was made carefully. Over time, as the military situation deteriorated, she had discussed it with her husband. She had written letters explaining her reasoning. She had arrived at a conclusion that, within the framework of the ideology she had embraced, had a terrible internal consistency. The children themselves, according to witnesses who interacted with them in the bunker, were by most accounts not aware of what their mother had decided. They had been told that they were going somewhere safe. They were confused by the underground environment, by the constant noise, by the unfamiliar faces. Teoldoronis, Helga, who was 12, and Hilt, who was 11, may have had some sense that something was very wrong. Helga, the eldest, reportedly asked questions that her mother and the bunker staff deflected, but the younger ones, 4-year-old Heidrun, 5-year-old Hedwig, had no framework for understanding what was happening. They played games when they could. They were given special food. They were, by the accounts of the adults who interacted with them, sweet-natured and ordinarily childlike in ways that made their presence in that place feel profoundly incongruous. Trodil Jung writes about teaching the older Goebbels children to type on her typewriter during one of the long empty stretches between conferences. They sat beside her and pressed the keys one at a time, delighted by the mechanism, laughing when the bell rang at the end of a line. She says that this moment, this entirely ordinary moment of children learning to type, exists in her memory as one of the most painful things she can recall from the entire period. Not because anything terrible was happening in that specific moment, but because of what she knew was going to happen, and because of how completely the children did not know. The routine of the children in the bunker was in some ways carefully maintained by Magda. They had regular meal times. They were put to bed at regular hours. They were kept, insofar as possible, within a structure that resembled the structure of their ordinary lives. Whether this was done out of genuine care for their psychological well-being in their remaining time, or out of a need on Magda's part to maintain the fiction that things were normal, is something that cannot now be determined with certainty. Probably, but human psychology does not usually operate in neat categories. The decision about how and when to kill the children was not simple to execute. The adults in the bunker, the doctors, the medical personnel, had not been collectively briefed. in advance. When Magda Goebbels finally made the preparations, she operated in the small hours of the night. Relying on a limited number of people, the children were given sedative medication, morphine-based, according to some accounts, so that they would be fully asleep. The cyanide was then administered, potassium cyanide, the same compound that killed Uwe Braun, that killed Himmler when he was captured, that killed dozens of the senior Nazi leadership across those final weeks. The bitter almond smell, the rapid unconsciousness, the complete cessation of cardiac activity within minutes. Helga, the 12-year-old, showed signs of having struggled. Her face, when found by Soviet investigators, showed bruising inconsistent with simply lying down and dying. This detail, small, specific, terrible, appears in the Soviet forensic reports and has been cited by historians ever since. It suggests that she had not been as fully sedated as her younger siblings, that she had known at Somme-les-Belles what was happening. I am telling you this not because you need more horror in your understanding of the Third Reich. You do not, but because the Goebbels children represent something that I think is important to confront directly. They were killed not by the Soviet soldiers storming Berlin, not by Allied bombing. They were killed by their own mother, in a concrete room underground, because their mother had decided that the ideology she had given her life to was more important than their lives. The ideology did not fail them by being defeated. It failed them by being exactly what it was, all the way to the end. Let me shift now to something that I want to spend some time on because it rarely gets adequate attention in the standard accounts. What was happening above the bunker during these weeks? What was Berlin actually like as the Soviet armies tightened their grip? Berlin in April 1945 was a dying city in a very literal sense. The population had been told to stay and defend it. Many had tried to flee west in the months before, but the roads had been chaotic, and the Nazi authorities had by turns blocked and allowed the refugee columns, depending on which way the ideological wind was blowing. By April, the city was full of people who had nowhere to go, sheltering in basements and subway tunnels and whatever structures remained standing, listening to the artillery that had been constant for weeks and was now continuous. The civilian experience of Berlin's fall was catastrophic by any measure. The Soviet assault on the city involved approximately 1.5 million men, T1OS, Belarusian front under Zhukov attacking from the east, the first Ukrainian front under Kanev attacking from the south, the second Belarusian front under Rokossovsky pressing from the north. The coordination of these forces was a remarkable feat of Soviet military organization, the product of 4 years of learning bought at an unimaginable price in blood. Against this force, Berlin's defenders were a patchwork, regular Wehrmacht units that had been retreating west for months, SS formations of varying quality and coherence, Volkssturm militias of old men and boys, Hitler Youth detachments whose fanaticism was in inverse proportion to their military utility. The street fighting that consumed Berlin in the final 2 weeks of April 1945 was among the most brutal urban combat in the history of warfare. The Soviets, who had fought through Stalingrad and Warsaw and 100 other destroyed cities, had developed tactics for urban combat that the German defenders, fighting on home ground for the first time, were not fully prepared to counter. Artillery was fired point-blank into buildings. Flamethrowers were deployed against fortified positions. The Tiergarten, the Great Park, at the center of Berlin, once one of the most beautiful green spaces in Europe, was churned into mud and craters by the fighting. Tens of thousands of civilians died in those 2 weeks. Many were killed by Soviet fire. Some were killed by German fire. The Nazi authorities were shooting and hanging their own people to the very end, for perceived defeatism or insufficient resistance. Some died in the fires that consumed entire city blocks. Some died in the subway tunnels. When the tunnels were flooded, a decision apparently made by German engineering units to slow the Soviet advance, which trapped and drowned an unknown number of civilians and wounded soldiers who had taken shelter there. The rapes were systematic and large-scale. Soviet soldiers, many of them motivated by genuine hatred for the country that had invaded theirs and killed tens of millions of their countrymen, committed sexual violence against German women on a scale that is documented in the historical record and that Soviet authorities suppressed and denied for decades. The numbers are difficult to establish with precision, but historians working with hospital records and survivor testimony have concluded that the total was in the hundreds of thousands across the final months of the war in Germany. This atrocity does not cancel out or excuse the atrocities of the regime that had just collapsed, but it is part of the full picture of what those weeks cost the people of Berlin, and it cannot be omitted. Down below, in the bunker, the people who had helped build the system responsible for all of this continued their conferences, and their rituals, and their careful hierarchies of rank and access. The sound that came through the concrete was the sound of consequences. They did not use that word. I want to talk about Speer, because Speer is one of the most complicated moral problems of the entire Nazi period, and because his relationship to the bunker in the final weeks illuminates something important about how sophisticated people can maintain sophisticated. Albert Speer was Hitler's architect, then his armaments minister, one of the most technically effective administrators the Third Reich produced, responsible for dramatically increasing German war production in the final years despite constant Allied bombing. He was also a man who had spent 12 years in close proximity to one of the most murderous regimes in history, who had used slave labor on a massive scale in his production programs, who had attended meetings at which the final solution was discussed in terms that made its nature clear, and who had nonetheless maintained both during and after the war a carefully constructed persona as the man who hadn't really known, who had tried to resist, who was the technocrat rather than the ideal. The Nuremberg Tribunal famously accepted significant elements of this persona. Speer was convicted of war crimes and crimes against humanity for his use of slave labor, but he escaped the death sentence that claimed Gring and Ribbentrop and others. He served 20 years in Spandau prison, then emerged to write a memoir, Inside the Third Reich, that became one of the best-selling accounts of the Nazi period, and that did enormous service in constructing the narrative of Speer as the aesthete who had been seduced by power and had eventually tried to resist. Historians spent the next 50 years systematically dismantling this narrative. The evidence is now extensive that Speer knew far more than he claimed, that his attendance at the Posen Conference in October 1943, where Himmler explicitly described the systematic murder of the Jewish population of Europe, two senior Nazi officials placed him in the room when this was said directly, that his use of concentration camp labor was not ignorance but policy, that the carefully maintained ignorance, he claimed, was, if not impossible, certainly convenient. Speer came to the bunker one last time on April 23, 1945. He flew into Berlin at considerable personal risk. The city was under air attack, and the Soviet encirclement was tightening. He had come, he said, to say goodbye to Hitler, to be honest with Hitler for the first time, to confess that he had been quietly working to undermine Hitler's scorched earth orders, the Nero Decree of March 19, which had commanded German industry and infrastructure to be destroyed rather than allowed to fall into Allied hands, orders that Speer had worked behind the scenes to prevent from being implemented. Whether the confession was genuine, or whether Speer had calculated that telling Hitler about his resistance would be treated with less severity than having Hitler discover it from other sources, is something that different people have assessed differently. Hitler's reaction was, by Speer's account, strange and sad rather than explosive. There was a long silence. Then Hitler said, more or less, that Speer had misunderstood him, that the German people had failed the test of the war, that if they fell, they deserved to fall, and that it was not worth preserving the infrastructure of a race that had proven unworthy. Speer left the bunker alive. Many people who had brought Hitler unwelcome news had not. He made it through the final weeks of the war, surrendered to the Allies, testified at Nuremberg in ways that made him appear cooperative and regretful, served his prison sentence, and wrote his memoir. He died in 1981 in a London hotel, having spent the preceding decades carefully managing his historical reputation. The historians have had the final word, but Speer himself never fully conceded the case against him, even at the very end. I want to spend a moment on what the Soviet commanders were experiencing during these same days, because the history of the bunker is sometimes told as if it exists in isolation, as if the world outside the concrete walls was simply a backdrop against which the internal drama played out. It was not. The Soviet commanders who were closing in on Berlin were human beings with their own psychology, their own history, their own understanding of what was happening. Marshal Georgy Zhukov had fought from the first weeks of the German invasion in June 1941. He had been the commander during the defense of Moscow in the winter of 1941-42, when the German advance had come close enough that government ministries were being evacuated eastward. He had commanded at Stalingrad at the great battles of 1943 and 1944. He was one of the most brilliant military commanders of the entire war by any objective measure. And he had spent 4 years watching the people around him die in numbers that are still almost impossible to comprehend. His understanding of what was happening in Berlin was filtered through all of that. When he received Krebs's communication about Hitler's death and the proposed negotiations, his first reaction was apparently to call Stalin in Moscow. Stalin asked if the information was credible. Zhukov said he believed so. Stalin told him to continue the attack. The negotiations were beside the point. Unconditional surrender. Now, and the war could end. For Zhukov, standing in a command post in a suburb of Berlin while the city burned, the question of what was happening in the bunker was ultimately a secondary question. What mattered was ending it. What mattered was that the men dying in the streets above the bunker, Soviet soldiers, German civilians, stopped dying. The ideological collapse, happening 8 meters underground, was history. The street fighting above was still the present tense. Zhukov, who actually sat across from Krebs on the morning of May 1st, described the meeting in his memoirs with a dryness that might be Soviet military professionalism or might be something closer to contempt. Here was a man representing a government that had invaded his country, that had killed millions of his countrymen, that had reduced city after city to rubble, proposing to negotiate the terms of what form the German collapse would take. Zhukov's response was the same as Zhukov's, the same as Stalin's: unconditional. Everything. Now, Krebs went back to the bunker and reported, and the last inhabitants of the Verbunker chose to attempt a breakout rather than accept those terms. The final, futile act of a system that had never learned to accept the world as it was. There is a coda to this story that I have been saving because I think it belongs at the end. In 2002, a documentary film called Blind Spot was released, consisting almost entirely of an extended interview with Trudel Jung, conducted shortly before her death. She was 78 years old when the interview was filmed. She had given many interviews over the years, had appeared in other documentaries, had written her memoir. But something about this last extended conversation has the quality of a final reckoning. Jung speaks about many things in the film, about the specific texture of her time in the bunker, about the things she saw and heard, about the decisions she did and did not make. And at one point, she says something that has stayed with me ever since I first heard it. She says that for years after the war, she told herself that she had been young, that she hadn't known, that she had been ignorant of the full scope of what was being done in the name of the regime she had served. And then, she says, she saw a plaque in Munich on the street where she had grown up, commemorating Sophie Scholl. Sophie Scholl had been executed by the Nazi regime in 1943, at the age of 21, for distributing anti-Nazi leaflets as part of the White Rose resistance movement, executed by guillotine in Stadtleim Prison. Sophie Scholl had been 21 years old, the same age Jung had been when she went to work for Hitler, and Sophie Scholl had known enough to risk her life, had known enough to act. Jung says that when she saw Sophie Scholl's plaque, when she understood that youth and ignorance had not been the insurmountable barrier she had told herself they were, something changed in how she understood her own story. She had not been a monster. She had not been a knowing participant in mass murder, but she had been something that was perhaps harder to name and harder to forgive a person who had chosen not to know, a person who had had enough access to the truth that the ignorance she claimed was a choice. Even if it was a choice she had not fully recognized at the time as a choice. The interview was filmed in 2002. Trudel Jung died on February 10, 2002, the same day that Downfall, the film that would later dramatize the final days of the bunker and that would make her account known to a worldwide audience, premiered at the Berlin Film Festival. she did not live to see it. Whether she would have found it accurate, or resonant, or useful, is a question that can no longer be asked. I think about Tro Dil Jung often when I think about the fool, not because she was the most important person in it, she was not, but because her testimony, and her late life reckoning with what her testimony meant, represents something that is rare and valuable in the historical record. A person who was inside the event, who survived it, and who spent the rest of her long life refusing to settle into a comfortable story about what she had been and what she had done. The discomfort she maintained in herself about her own experience is, I think, the most honest and useful response to the story of those 18 rooms. We are not going to get a comfortable story out of the Vorbunker. We are not supposed to. The comfort of historical distance is a trap. The events in those rooms are close enough to the present that many of the structures they produced, political, cultural, psychological, are still visible in the world we live in. The specific pathologies of the Nazi system are not generic. They are human. They are made of recognizable materials, fear and loyalty in hierarchy, and the powerful desire to not be the person who says the uncomfortable thing in the room. The last shot fired in the Vorbunker was on April 30th, 1945. The last person to leave the bunker alive was sometime in the early hours of May 2nd, 1945. The Soviet flag was raised over the Reichstag, the building that the Nazis had burned, the building whose ruins had stood as backdrop 2 years of war on the evening of April 30th, while Hitler was still burning in the garden below. 80 years on, the parking lot in Berlin, where the bunker used to be, receives tourists who sometimes don't notice the plaque. Cars park on the concrete above the rooms, where the last 18 days of the Third Reich played out. People walk past. Life continues. The city was rebuilt and divided and reunified and rebuilt again. The concrete of the bunker is gone, but the history is still there, just below the surface, as it always will be. There is no comfortable ending to this. There is only the accounting, the work of trying to understand what happened and how it happened and what it means. That work is not finished. It may never be finished. But it matters that we keep doing it. Subscribe if you're not already here. Share this if it changed something in the way you understand that time. And I will see you in the next one. Let me take you to a place that most historians skip over too quickly. The question of what the German people outside the bunker actually knew, and when they knew it in these final weeks. Because the story of the Vorbunker is not only the story of the people inside it, it is also the story of the millions of people on the outside who were living in the reality that the bunker was refusing to acknowledge. The German public's relationship to information about the war's progress had been managed for years by the most sophisticated propaganda apparatus in history. Goebbels' ministry controlled the newspapers, the radio, the news. The language in which the war was described had evolved through a precise set of euphemisms designed to make defeats sound like strategic repositioning, encirclements sound like temporary situations, catastrophes sound like setbacks on the road to eventual victory. German civilians had been living inside this information environment for 12 years, and many of them had internalized it to a significant degree. But by early 1945, the propaganda was failing in ways that were visible even to those who were responsible for producing it. You cannot tell people that their city was not bombed when they can see the rubble from their windows. You cannot tell a family that the Eastern Front is stabilized when their son's letters home have stopped arriving. The gap between the managed reality and the experienced reality had become too large to maintain. What replaced propaganda for many ordinary Germans in those final weeks was rumor. Dense, fast-moving, often partially accurate rumor. The refugee columns moving westward carried information specific, frightening, ground-level information about what the Soviet advance looked like, what it felt like to be in a town when the Red Army arrived. This information moved laterally through the German population in ways that the propaganda ministry could not intercept or manage. People talked to each other in basement shelters, in bread lines, in the brief pauses between air raid sirens. They exchanged fragments of what they knew and what they had heard. And the picture that emerged from these fragments was bleaker and more accurate than anything that appeared in the official press. Many Germans in those final weeks were engaged in a complicated psychological negotiation, holding simultaneously the official narrative, the rumored reality, and their own direct experience, trying to reconcile all three into something they could live with. Some people continued to believe, or to say they believed, in the possibility of a German reversal. The Wunderwaffe, the miracle weapon, had been hinted at by Nazi propaganda for years, the suggestion that some decisive technological development would turn the tide. Some clung to this. Others had privately concluded that the war was lost but continued to perform the public rituals of belief because the alternative was dangerous. Still others had given up on any version of the official story and were focused entirely on practical questions of survival. How to get food, where to take cover, which direction to run when the moment came. The soldiers defending Berlin in those final weeks presented an even more complex psychology. Some of them, particularly the SS units and the Hitler Youth, retained a genuine fanaticism that made them more dangerous in the street fighting than their numbers or their equipment would suggest. The conviction that death in battle was preferable to surrender, that fighting to the last man and the last bullet was not merely a military obligation, but a moral one, was real in some of these formations and produced a ferocity that cost the Soviets significantly. But many of the defenders of Berlin were not fanatics. They were exhausted, traumatized men who had been fighting a losing war for years and who were now being asked to fight for a city that was already being destroyed around them, under commanders whose orders ranged from tactically sound to operationally delusional. The regular Wehrmacht soldiers defending Berlin knew that the war was lost. They could see it in the maps, even the maps they were given, which were more accurate than the maps in the bunker. They could feel it in the ratio of their forces to the Soviet forces pressing against them. They fought, many of them, not because they believed in victory, but because desertion was shot and surrender required someone to actually surrender to, which was not always immediately available in the chaos of street fighting. Die Sturm, the people's militia, assembled from men too old, too young, or too infirm for regular military service, represents one of the most tragic chapters of the final defense. Boys of 14 and 15, given a Panzerfaust anti-tank weapon and a few hours of training, sent into the streets of Berlin to try to stop Soviet armor. Old men in World War I medals, dug out of retirement and handed rifles they were not physically capable of using effectively. These were the troops that the strategic fantasies of the bunker, the Steiner offensive, the Wank relief, had been intended to supersede. When those fantasies failed to materialize, the Volkssturm was what was left. The human cost of this decision, the decision to defend Berlin rather than negotiate a surrender that might have come weeks earlier, and at a fraction of the human cost, is impossible to calculate with precision. Historians estimate that something between 100,000 and 300,000 Germans died in the defense of Berlin, depending on how the boundaries of the battle are defined and which categories of casualties are included. Soviet losses were also severe, somewhere in the range of 80,000 dead. The battle for Berlin was not militarily necessary by any coherent strategic analysis. Germany had lost the war. The question was only how long it would take the regime to admit it, and how many people would die in the interim. The answer, which was determined in a concrete room 8 meters underground, was quite a long time and quite a lot of people. I want to talk about one more figure before I close this account. Someone who occupies an important place in the story of the bunker's final days and who is often not given sufficient attention. His name was Heinz Linge, and he was Hitler's personal valet, the man responsible for managing Hitler's personal quarters, his clothing, his daily physical needs. Linge had been in this role since 1935. He had traveled with Hitler to every command post, every diplomatic meeting, every visit to the front. He knew, in the most intimate, physical sense, more about Hitler as a person than almost anyone else alive. He knew his precise clothing sizes, he knew his sleeping habits, he knew the specific arrangements of objects on his desk that Hitler preferred. He knew which medications were kept where and in what order they were administered. He knew the details of a life that most people never see of any person, let alone of a historical figure of this magnitude. Linge was present on April 30th, 1945. He was one of the small group of people who waited outside the door of Hitler's private suite, and when enough time had passed, estimates vary on exactly how much time, he was one of the people who opened the door. What he saw in that room Lynch described in testimony given to various interviewers and investigators over the following decades, and in a memoir published in German in 1980, he was also captured by the Soviets and subjected to intensive interrogation about what he had witnessed, and the Soviet intelligence reports of those interrogations have since been partially declassified and studied by historians. Lynch's account of the moment he opened the door and what he saw inside it is one of the primary sources for our understanding of how Hitler died. His testimony has been examined, cross-referenced with other accounts, and subjected to forensic analysis. The details he provided, the position of the bodies, the smells, the physical evidence have been found to be consistent with other evidence about the manner of death. He was a reliable witness in the sense that what he saw he described accurately. But what I find most striking about Lynch's later testimonies is not the specific details of that moment. It is the broader account of his experience of the final days. He describes the collapse of the bunker's internal order in the final 48 hours with a specificity that brings the experience alive. The way that people who had maintained professional composure for weeks finally began to lose it. The way that alcohol consumption increased markedly in the final hours. The way that the carefully maintained hierarchies of rank and access began to dissolve as the situation became undeniable. The way that people started having conversations they had not been able to have before. Honest conversations. Frightened conversations. Conversations in which people said out loud what they had been thinking privately for months. Lynch survived the Soviet captivity. He was released in 1955, one of the last German prisoners to return from Soviet camps. He died in 1980, the year his memoir was published. He was, by the accounts of those who interviewed him in his later years, a quiet man, not given to dramatic reflection. He had done his job. He had witnessed extraordinary things. He had tried, as best he could, to describe them accurately. He was not Trödel Jung. He did not spend his later years in active reckoning with what he had witnessed. He was, in a sense, what Rahusmish was. A man who had been present at the center of history by virtue of a job, and who had survived it, and who had tried to live an ordinary life afterward. That is the full complexity of the full. It was not populated by monsters in the obvious sense. It was populated by human beings in extremis, human beings who had been shaped by a monstrous system into something that served the system's ends, human beings who were capable of warmth and kindness in their personal interactions while being part of a structure that produced incomprehensible horror at scale. The gap between the personal and the systemic in the Vorbunker is one of the most instructive and most disturbing things. About Italiano. The historians who have written most honestly about this period are the ones who resist the temptation to resolve this gap, to say, they were all monsters, which releases us from having to think too hard about how ordinary people became part of it, or to say, they were mostly victims of circumstance, which releases them from accountability. The honest position is that both things can be simultaneously true, and that the simultaneous truth of both things is what we need to sit with. April 30th, 1945. A gunshot. A garden. Fire. May 8th, 1945. Germany's unconditional surrender. The war in Europe was over. The accounting was just beginning. And in some sense, the accounting is still going on. The Nuremberg trials, the denazification programs, the decades of historical scholarship, the legal proceedings against individuals that continued into the 21st century. All of this is the ongoing work of trying to account for what happened. And the work of accounting is not only about the past, it is also always about the present, about what we are capable of, about what the systems we live within are capable of, about what the gap between official reality and actual reality looks like, and what happens when people stop being willing to name it. The bunker is gone. The people are gone. The system they served is gone. What remains is the evidence, and the question, and the ongoing work of trying to understand what it means. I will see you in the next